So my work started in this place called Ladakh, which is actually West Tibet, and it's up high on the Tibetan plateau. The Dalai Lama is the spiritual head, but many people still haven't heard of it, which is wonderful, because there's far too much tourism as it is. And I was asked to go out there in 1975 to help make a film. I was a linguist, I wasn't a filmmaker, but the filmmakers knew that this part of the world had been completely sealed off from the outside world and wanted me to try to pick up a bit of the language so they could communicate to the local people. I went out, I was living in Paris, I wasn't an activist, I loved nature, I loved art, I had studied psychology, still interested in all of that, but Ladakh turned me into a full-time activist. And it was because what I encountered there was truly the most peaceful and the happiest society I had ever encountered. And I had traveled a lot, and I spoke a lot of European languages already, but I'd also visited the Zapatistas in Mexico and had been to parts of Africa and so on. But what I realized afterwards, what I found in Ladakh was a culture that hadn't been transformed by missionaries or by slavery, later colonialism, or later development. And all of those forces, which spread across the world, were basically about imposing a top down monoculture on people, a system, an ism that prevented people from living in their own way, adapted to their own part of the world, having developed their knowledge about specific plants, specific weather patterns, and they were free. They were free to develop and grow according to their own inner understanding. Now, what I saw, what I witnessed, was people who really couldn't understand when I talked about depression in the West. I should mention, I learned to speak the language fluently very quickly, and I was able to communicate with people before the advent of the modern development system. And at that point, people were telling me regularly, we have plenty to eat, plenty to drink, you should stay in the winter, because in the winter we have so much, they had festivals, they didn't work in the winter. They worked roughly, a third of the time that we work, and always at a relaxed pace. Every mother had 10 caretakers for every child. Every field where they were sowing or harvesting had plenty of people, and it was intergenerational, so that everyone was learning as they grew up how to care for children, how to care for the land, how to build a house, how to weave their own clothes out of their own fibers, diet with fibers in the region. It was quite remarkable to have that degree of self-reliance and self-respect and joy. And because they hadn't been threatened by, for instance, as many groups in South America, by Spanish conquerors or conquerors from the outside, they were incredibly open and welcoming to outsiders. And when I would tell them that in the West we had things like depression, I really couldn't get them to understand what that meant. Suicide was something that happened maybe once in a lifetime. Now, suicide there is probably one a month, and it's usually young people. So I'm coming from an extreme experience of experiencing a fully localized economy, human scale, ecological, indigenous, where the feminine, the spiritual, the values that guided the culture are all those that we strive for. But I think what we're failing to look at is the economy as a part of it. And so when we're interested in indigenous culture, let's also look at, well, how did they actually live? So that when we now realize, how we're longing for community, how we love being in a place like this, how we benefit from plant medicine, how we benefit from the chanting and dancing together, which, by the way, most indigenous cultures, everybody sang and danced together as part of daily life. And there wasn't a sense, oh, I'm not good enough because I haven't become a professional singer, I'm not a global star. Everybody felt that they could and they did, and some were better and some were worse. And this is related also to when I asked mothers, I was doing a research project with someone who was studying childcare, and we asked mothers if they worried when babies couldn't walk by the time they were about 1. And I had to ask the question, I think, 5, 6, 7 times, because they couldn't understand the question. And then when they finally did, they just laughed and they said, of course they're going to walk at some point. So I realized in this contrast between what was happening as the modern system came in, I realized that the whole view of progress has actually affected us and how we look at our children and our fear of not being perfect, of not doing the right thing at the right time. And I wrote a book called Ancient Futures, and in that book I talked about how at that point, this is, it came out in 1990, and at that point already in America, people were having their brains, their skull size measured in the womb and starting to worry about the intelligence of the child. They were signing up for a school before the child was born because they're afraid that they weren't going to get a good place and then a good, successful career. What I want to tell you is that I am firmly convinced that almost all our problems, from our inner fear of not being perfect enough, from our fear that our child won't get the best career and the best school, from our fear, well, virtually everything, emanate from an economic system. And I don't want to bore you too much with many details about it, but I really believe that the last piece in the puzzle of really creating a huge turning in the direction that we need to move as humanity has to do with the economic side of it. It has to do with the fact that we need to realize that the dominant economy that is operating in Britain right here, right now, pressures are being created that come from a global system. And unfortunately, very few people look at that. Very, very few people. The global system is being looked at by people who continue to promote global growth at the expense of local economies. So there are people who are analyzing the economy. They are the people who will tell us, oh, the market is saying this, and oh, our country can't do this, and our country can't afford to look after the aged, can't afford to look after the sick, can't afford to look after the environment, but we've got to do everything to increase global trade. Now, global trade has been promoted from global traders for a very long time. So I just quickly want you to just think about the fact that from the beginnings of this economy, it started with slavery, it started with enclosures. So it's always been about driving people away from the land into urban centers. And we're not aware that from the beginning, we were becoming dependent on global trade. And so when in England people were pushed off the land to become cheap labor for cheap cotton, in India people had been pushed away from producing a range of things for their local economies to produce cotton or tea or other products for these global traders. It was sort of for the West, but the problem isn't so much the West anymore, it's a global system. So I won't belabor that too much more. I just hope I could interest you in looking at that. I hope, from my point of view, having seen in Ladakh, later on in Bhutan, How many of you have heard of Bhutan? So most of you have heard of Bhutan. So you know it was this little kingdom and also isolated from this colonial and later on development model. And they were opened up roughly the same time as Ladakh. And I worked in Bhutan over a 5-year period. And I witnessed in Bhutan the same pattern as in Ladakh. In Ladakh, where I arrived in 1975, learned to speak the language fluently, encountered the most peaceful, joyous, vital, humorous, energetic people I had ever met. Just fell in love completely, gave up my job in Paris, stayed, and I basically stayed since then. I used to be there for half of every year, working with the local people, trying to find a way to meet the modern world that wouldn't destroy the fundamentals of real strong community, deep connection to nature, deep self-respect, deep sense of agency. And we'd had some wonderful projects, but they were not enough. People still find Ladakh very inspiring. We did help to build up enough momentum to create a local government which is committed to organic agriculture, to these things that we're talking about. But very early on, probably in the second year already, I was so aware that so many Westerners weren't aware of how they were contributing to the destruction in Ladakh. They weren't aware that by contributing to conventional development, they were actually helping to destroy genuinely ecological, genuinely community-based cultures and contributing to a type of schooling. They would often fund the schools and so on, that just totally took children away from learning anything about their own environment, about their own culture. And they were basically trained for jobs in the city. That's what education has done from the beginning. And in the city, when they got in there suddenly weren't enough jobs for everybody. There was suddenly unemployment, which had never existed for thousands of years. With the unemployment and the fact that when the government was Buddhist, it would favor Buddhists to give out jobs. When it was Muslim, it would favor the Muslims. And in Ladakh, they had a majority of Buddhists, but they also had a minority of Muslims. They'd been living side by side for 500 years. They'd never had group conflict in 500 years. After 10 years of modern development, they started having tensions, and after 15 years, they were killing each other. Even Buddhist grandmothers said to me, we've got to exterminate the Muslims, because otherwise they're going to exterminate us. And it was the young men in the community who were bringing home these messages to their grandmothers, inspiring this fear. In Bhutan, the majority were Buddhist, and there were Hindus that had been there for generations. And at this same flashpoint of development reaching this point, almost exactly the time period, in Bhutan, Hindus and Buddhists were killing each other. So I'm coming from very unusual, extreme experiences. What was extreme was that these two places had been so untouched. They hadn't, from the time of the Spanish, coming into South America, where they hadn't been pushed and pressured. They were living freely and were much wealthier, better off. And when the development came into Ladakh, it came at such a late point that people were not only being subjugated by this economy pushing them to fight over scarce jobs, and jobs that were unbelievably meaningless. Maybe I should just mention, one of the things that happened with agriculture was that the whole thing destroys small farmers everywhere. This whole development model, small farmers are being eradicated. So defending small farmers is one of the most important things we can do to find our way back to healthier economies. And anyway, when seeing what happened in agriculture there, it was like so black and white, you can't imagine. By 75, DDT had been outlawed in the West, but experts coming to Ladakh through the Indian government were promoting DDT. People had no information that it had been banned and why. And they had no experience of pesticides. They didn't believe in killing things. But now suddenly they were saying, put this white powder, everything will be fine. They brought in even asbestos and built a hospital virtually of just asbestos. And people found broken bits of asbestos and were baking their bread on it. Now, when I started then speaking the language fluently, bringing information campaigns, and it was hard because I wasn't an expert. The men who were bringing this in were, in gray suits and gray haired and the typical expert that you're supposed to listen to. And here's this woman, what does she know? She speaks our language. So I would bring out counter-experts. I would bring friends from the ecology movement in the West to explain how we had now managed to ban DDT, how we were taking down hospitals made of asbestos and so on. So this whole thing I'm talking about here has a lot to do with still a lack of information between the most traditional, the most land-based people on the planet, and particularly farmers, but most indigenous people who are still working the land, and the urban, particularly Western people in the modern world. And we've been trying to build bridges both ways for now almost 50 years. And in Bristol this September, we will have people from every continent. It's about, altogether there'll be about 80 speakers. It'll be very dense, but I hope very inspiring to hear voices from around the world who are finding that when they focus on rebuilding community and rebuilding their deep ecological wisdom, their knowledge about the specifics of their place, knowing that tree is different from the next tree, knowing that the leaf in every tree is unique and different every moment, treasuring that experiential knowledge, cultivating it, rebuilding. They're working both with the land and with people. The caring for children, linking the youngest and the oldest. All of this is part of what I call ancient futures trends. And so much of what Satish was saying about technology comes from seeing how technology very dramatically separates us from one another, but even from our own bodies, from our own skills, from our full intelligence as embodied human beings. And that's another thing. In indigenous culture, children were always there. Yeah, even in the most serious, religious ceremonies, there were still children. And for women, I just also want to say that women in that traditional culture, I felt had a stronger position, than in Sweden, where I grew up. Because the position was strong, because as a woman, you had so many people helping with every child. You had a much more relaxed, easy relationship. You were in a basket of relationship, not intense, just nuclear family, it's a bipolar relationship that's very hard to keep stable. So the building of more relationships for every child is one thing that, when I do write a book about what I learned about childcare, that's one of the things I'll be really emphasizing. Because many mothers now feel guilty. They've been made to feel that they should be there 24/7 for the child. And of course the mother is needed, but the intensity of what's happening today is turning what should be one of the most beautiful experiences that a woman can ever have almost into a torture chamber. So I'm seeing a lot of young women who are really struggling today, because it's quite different from even 10, 15, 20 years ago. The time pressures have increased. There is more coming at us every day. So much of that has to do with the economy and with technology. So from all this very complex story that I'm trying to tell, I'm basically saying that the economic system that started with slavery and that started with colonialism, when we thought it changed, into something called development, economic development and economic growth. It continued in the same direction to support global traders at the expense of local people. Today, our governments are signing in black and white that we will not do anything that reduces your profit. If we do, you can take us to court. They are signing agreements with global corporations in the trade treaties saying that Monsanto, Nestle, Coca-Cola, BlackRock, you can do whatever you like. We can't raise the minimum wage, we can't protect the environment, because if that inhibits your profit, you'll take us to court. Now, most people don't know this, so a lot of what I'm saying, in many ways, people say, well, we know all this, but people know that corporations have too much power. They often think that people in the corporations and in government are all evil, trying to destroy us. My take on this is that we're really dealing with a type of blindness where particularly people who've been trained to operate in the financial system, to create wealth within these global corporations, they are so clueless about the actual effects. But the actual effects have to do with everything, like I said, like how much time a mother spends with her baby, what is happening to our daily life, what's happening to our food. The most important things we do as human beings is how we rear our children and how we rear our food. Those two activities are shadow work. Up at the top, where people are talking about the market and the economy, they have no idea. No idea. And the evidence that's being built now about what we need, it's there. But it's fragmented. It's specialists who now more and more understand the need for community, more and more understand the deep connections to nature are essential for our well-being, more and more understand that for the trauma, most of it caused by this economic system, plant medicine and other modalities can be extremely helpful. All of that knowledge, it's not under one umbrella. We don't have a paradigm shift that's helping us transition towards the way of life that we're all longing for. And honestly, there are so many studies that show what people want across culture. They want good relationships with family and friends. They want a better relationship with nature. They want to have more time to enjoy life. So when you then look at the bigger picture, I really, really hope that you'll be interested in pursuing what we've called the economics of happiness. And we made a film by that name that I really hope you'll look at and share. Before that, we made a film called Ancient Futures, which tried to lay out some of the picture that I just tried to spell out about Ladakh. And of course, my book, Ancient Futures, does also try to do that. And I have a more recent book called Local is Our Future. So the key lesson from a lot of experience with indigenous culture, so, more than 40 years in Ladakh, but after the book Ancient Futures and the film came out, we had basically people passionate about ancient futures, translating it into 47 languages, either the book or the film. So from all over the world, people had experienced indigenous culture and modern life, usually both. When they'd experienced both, they were passionate about a path forward where we maintain the foundations that we need for genuine happiness and, of course, human and ecological well-being completely linked. So that's what sort of our message is, that if we look at the bigger picture today, we will see we are so close to being able to make that transition. But if we don't watch out, big business is onto the need to localize. They are actually seeing that the transport lines where they are, you don't know this probably, but they are importing and exporting milk and butter from the UK, same quantities in and out. US exports as much beef as it imports. every day we have this massive, unnecessary, criminal trade, and the climate movement isn't talking about that. It would be the fastest way to reduce emissions without any major trauma to anyone except corporate profit. For people saying, okay, we'll keep our milk over here, you keep yours, and we'll reduce emissions massively. That would be systemically the way to really reduce rapidly. But because we have corporations that have so much power and think tanks that tell us that local food economies don't reduce emissions, that tell us that the local, well, I must go faster. But I just say, with the propaganda that's coming out from corporate think tanks, just beware that in the climate negotiations, emissions from global trade are nowhere to be seen. They are not measured, they are not looked at. When we talk about a country's carbon footprint, it's a complete joke. A 5-year-old child would say, what are you talking about? Britain's footprint, and you're not talking about the fact that fish is being sent to China to be processed and sent back again? You're not talking about exporting milk out and back in again? You're not mentioning any of the energy on the other side of the world in a globalized economy where more and more of the local production is being destroyed, replaced with energy-intensive madness. So honestly, if we at the grassroots could just look at some of this and start doing what I call big picture activism, this is not about blaming particular companies. It's not even about saying we're going to shut down Coca-Cola overnight. It's about realizing that our governments are deregulating global business, not counting emissions from them, while screaming at us that we shouldn't drive our cars, that we shouldn't go on holiday, that we now are going to pay X amount for energy because those giant companies need to make even bigger profit for billionaires. We're in a really amazingly good situation right now to have some clear voices really spell out what this economic juggernaut is about, show how it's leading to self-blame. You know, those mothers who are feeling self-blame because they're not with their babies 24/7, at the same time feeling so guilty for driving their cars, at the same time feeling so guilty that they're shopping at the supermarket because the food is cheaper there. Now, we need clarity, not to now create blame for individuals, but for genuine systems change. So the genuine system change is going to be from global to local. How local, that's another discussion that would need democratic, real debate, that would need, real looking at trade-offs. But nobody would stand in front of you and tell you that I believe that we should make multi-billionaires even richer while squeezing people across the world now so that middle-class people have to run faster and faster and faster just to have a roof over their head, some heating, and some food on the table. Nobody would be able to stand there and defend that. But we don't have a movement for economic change. And I'm seeing that one of the problems is that people feel, well, I'm not an economist. So we're bowing down at the specialized knowledge of the economists. And the economists from the outset have been saying comparative advantage, it's a fundamental principle in economics, which is it's not in your interest in a country or region to produce a range of things for yourself. It's not in your interest. You should specialize for export, and then you can import what you like. So I want to talk more about the local, but it's so important that we understand the global to see why local is the systemic solution and how it's the ism, localism is the ism that would end all isms, because it's about understanding that real development, real economic activity needs to be involving and determined by people from the bottom up. And you see that particularly clearly in the non-Western world, where people aren't so homogenized. We want a world where people can maintain their languages, where they can maintain their self-respect. Diversity, diversity, diversity is a fact of life. And adapting to diversity would mean more localized economies. Like I say, just how localized needs to be discussed, because there are trade-offs, and just what kind of technology makes sense. Right now, for localization, we are encouraging that people who want to make change actually travel, if it's in order to really contribute to learning and understanding. And we're particularly keen on that bridge between the most industrialized urban and the more rural, traditional farming and indigenous cultures. There is one of the biggest social movements in the world, is Via Campesina. How many of you have heard of Via Campesina? How many of you out there have heard of Via Campesina? It's still very few, but thank goodness some of you have, because we've been trying to carry their message for a very long time. They are an association of small farmers from around the world, and there are about 200 million small farmers. And they've been trying to raise awareness about the way that the trade treaties are destroying them, because they're opening the door for giant business to come in and dump artificially cheap food. And this is why when we shop in the supermarket, it's cheaper, often even if it's been transported to China to be processed, even if the apples have come from Argentina. And it's all because our governments are using taxes, subsidies, and regulations to support the global instead of the local. If we shifted that overnight, it would be amazing what it would do for jobs, for meaningful jobs, accountable jobs where you can see the impact of what you do, for reestablishing a relationship between farmers and consumers, for rebuilding also a fabric where we know the person in the shop, we know the name, and that person may have come from India, may have come from another part of the world, but it's not a label. This is not a Muslim, this is not a foreigner, this is, whatever the name is, Mohammed, or this is Ben, this is Robert, these are people. Every single individual is unique. Prejudice grows with abstraction, with distance. When we think we know what's going on the other side of the world, and we develop ideas about how we're going to make it better without any real idea of what's going on. So we're so mediated now by information that is third hand. So we, at another level, I just say this for those of you who might understand it. Sorry, I don't want to sound like I'm talking down to you, but how many of you have heard of Ian McGilchrist? Wow, that's really good. He's a real buddy, and his deep understanding of this really important part of the right brain. So this difference in left brain and right brain completely spells out, in my mind, of what's been going on with this globalizing path that has been blindly promoted by people who become more and more stubborn because they're basing their knowledge on this map, this superficial map that they're stubbornly adhering to. In the meanwhile, the realities of life, the complexities, the contradictions, that nothing is ever the same, the constant change, the quantum nature of life, and we're talking about nature out there and human nature, that is what we recognize when we're more in tune with the right side of the brain, which means respecting experiential knowledge more. What we've grown up to do is to treat experiential knowledge is anecdotal. You know, you can only say the sun is shining or the sun was shining yesterday if someone else has written it. It's not worth anything if you happen to have seen it. And so we're in this terrible situation. And that also, by the way, there are many ways that also marginalizes the more feminine. But, you know, won't go into all of that. But just to say that Ian, you know, has supported, you know, my book and says, read this book, so I hope you'll come. I hope there are some of that, of this book here, Local is Our Future. And, but I'm trying to think what is the most important take-home message I want to. I guess maybe the most important take-home message I want to. I hope we'll have time for some questions and things. Is that right now, being in touch with the way that we have been in my small organization called Local Futures, and I have a little team, and we've ended up spread out around the world. And by the way, a lot of the organizations I work with are now spread out, including Via Campesina, but also an organization called Etc., an organization called Grain. These are very good organizations who've looked at agriculture from the bigger picture. Anyway, what we're seeing in our work, having promoted localization with a central focus on food and farming. Remember, food and farming, you know, it's the only thing we produce, food, that everybody needs every day. To have our governments ensure that our food comes from further and further away in a time of climate change is just absolutely maddening. So shortening those distances is so much more fundamental and so much more healing of people and planet than most people realize. So the local food movement, the worldwide local food movement, which doesn't recognize itself as a movement yet, but that's what we are seeing in our work. We've helped to start things in Korea and Japan and on every continent. And we're in touch with this, and we are so thrilled by the number of new news that come in every day. Almost every day in my inbox, I get almost as much good news as I get bad news. So I feel so heartened by this amazing trajectory where people are going against this huge pressure from all the taxes, regulations that make local food artificially more expensive, that regulate in ways that make it very difficult. Look, despite that, from the bottom up, usually led by women, most of the initiatives are started by women, there is this amazing movement out there. So there is so much to be grateful for, there is so much to cherish, there's so much in life itself, and there is all this evidence, but help us get it out. We need to get that evidence out, just like we need to get the evidence out that those shorter distances not only reduce emissions massively, but through diversified farming, sequester carbon, truly sequester carbon. Carbon, by the way, makes me almost spit when I say the word. It was brought in by big business to create a tradable commodity to make them rich while creating a theater of what we should be doing. And not consciously. You know, I met Al Gore. I've met some of the people who've been part of this language, and it's not a conscious attempt to destroy, but we need to be having a stronger voice from the grassroots. And just please look at our website. We have launched something called World Localization Day and lots of initiatives going on around the world. It's all small, it's all limited. Our event in Bristol, we'll only have about 1,000 people there, but we have 80 speakers from around the world. Satish will also be speaking, and Ian as well, Ian McGilchrist, and some of the farmers from Via Campesina around the world. So please do think of coming to that end of September. And yeah, there's a lot more good news, small, micro, at the grassroots. There's a lot there that we can support and feel joyous about. But it is urgent. AI as a tool of the dominant path is going to speed up the destruction quite a lot. And we need to be aware of that too. And Ian will be talking about that at our summit. So, yeah, thank you very much. I'd love some questions.
Hi, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm totally on board. I'm an organic farmer and have a sort of small permaculture farm in Somerset called Middle Ground Growers. Yeah, I guess my question is, like, in this sort of shift to like local and sort of smaller or more human scale, what sort of bridging work is needed to be done with like the current food system actors? So a lot of the movement so far, I think that's like a very focus on like, it is, you know, very like small scale grassroots, new projects, new farms starting, but then it feels like the bridging work to like a lot of the conventional farms or the bigger farms is actually seeing so much huge potential with like the regenerative movement and things like that, and actually that's creating more space and land access for more like whether it's, you know, market gardens on their land or things like that. And it feels like if the movement engages more with those actors, yeah, what's the potential of that rather than totally recreating or, yeah.
Well, I would say that the most important thing in the farming sector is actually not just to look at the production side, whether it's permaculture, whether it's biodynamic, whether it's regenerative, but to understand the systemic need to look at the market. What is the market? And that's where the consumer comes in. In this country, there would be far less than 1% of people who are actually farming, you know, in any sort of proper way, much less. And here we have then 99% of people who are not informed enough. And so we're trying to create a sort of activism among ordinary citizens to both do what you can to grow yourself, but more importantly, to protect the farmers who are there, who are very threatened by the dominant policies, and to help build more new systems. And it's about the system. It's about the creation of a more conscious market with the farm. And it can sound quite hard and not doable, but I'm amazed at how much is happening. We have to realize that very often the people who do it are fairly well off. So then you get a lot of criticism from the corporate think tanks saying it's elitist. Because in the beginning, local food can be a bit more expensive than the supermarket food. But there are so many examples of middle-class people or wealthier people coming together to create the systems, then doing things that lower the price for people who can't afford it. There are even examples of some of our colleagues having pressured enough so that in some states in America, people who get food stamps from the government can get twice as much value if they shop in the farmer's market than if they shop in the supermarket. Things like that are what we need with a more aware society. But you know, we're generally so out of touch with what's actually happening there, and we're locked now into this speedy thing where we do have to worry about the prices. And so I'm just asking people to take a deep breath. And what we're really offering, I didn't talk enough about the psychological healing. There's huge psychological healing. As many of you know, if you're in the sort of medicine world, of deeper community. Deeper community meaning that we are actually loved for who we are, imperfect, with flaws. You know, the 12-step program is the best, very clear example of how vital community is to totally transform people with entrenched addictions, with, you know, all kinds of addictions, sex addiction, drug addiction, etc. And it's the sharing of the story together and feeling that connection. Just one more thing, which is, I've gone off track, of course, now, but about that, and that is that now there's so much understanding about the need to connect to nature, but I feel not enough emphasis on that deeper human connection, which I saw very clearly, again, in these traditional cultures, how fundamental that was, that you be known as you are, not locked into, you know, a wall of a nuclear family where the only place where you sort of really know each other. And on the outside, you have to be perfect and you have to be like the film images, beautiful and perfectly happy, everything is fine, and you never feel that you're loved for who you really are. So it's that deeper sharing, that more vulnerable, real, essentially love, warts and all, that we need. And as more and more of us are traumatized now, we have so much stress. The localizing path that we're talking about is one that includes that conscious community connection. But if we want to accelerate the healing, if we come together in local groups, and then with the agenda of how can I help heal myself, how can I help heal the planet, the fastest trajectory is if you get organized into a local food scheme, you actually spend some time on the land, and your children and perhaps your grandparents or older people, so it starts rebuilding more of the intergenerational. The healing that happens through that deeper human connection, the connection to the land, and to producing something that everybody needs. It's been transforming prisoners, torture victims. It's just an amazing healing. So one message that, from me to farmers, I'm saying please be willing to look at how you can help educate the consumer. And one of your messages could be about the remarkable healing that comes from it. There's lots of evidence. There are books written about it. Um, and it's a bit problematic that sometimes farmers have been conventional farmers, so trained into the conventional path that it can take a while for them to change their thinking. But I've experienced the most beautiful changes there too, and I've seen it in several farmers markets that we've helped to start, where the farmers, like one farmer said to me, I've been a farmer my whole life, but we felt like serfs. Now since you started the farmers market, it's like a different galaxy. And farmers in this particular market that I'm very close to, 20 years later, they're all doing much better. Their children are now going into farming, and they were conventional farmers. But what changed them was moving away from selling to the central market that demanded avocados of all one size, straight bananas. I mean, we have no idea in this global food system, the waste. The estimate is that about a third of the food that's produced actually reaches the plate. And then on top of that, that growing has destroyed the land because it's monoculture. I mean, it's just, so when you look at the madness of the climate discourse, the madness of what's going on in agriculture, you'll feel very, very positive about supporting these alternatives. And you'll feel so happy to find that there are many more than you probably realize. I'll love another question. I promise I won't be so long in my answer.
Hi, Helena. I just wanted to say such a big thank you because you've been doing this work for so many decades, even before it got so crazy with globalization. So just to start by saying so much gratitude for your work. I work in building people's imaginations and building a movement of imagination activism. And often I hear from very, very different people very similar visions for the kind of world they want to see, which is often a very local one. Again and again, I imagine being able to find my food near my home. I imagine living in a community of people I know. And I was curious whether in your work you see kind of blocks to imagining that kind of future, and where are the blocks that people, when you help paint this picture, where do people get stuck?
Well, I'd love to hear from some of you, maybe where you get stuck. I think, particularly for men, it can sound far too limiting and it sounds too small. And I keep wanting to try to change the language and maybe not say local, regional. A type of regionalization is also what's happening and what's needed. So it's not, it's complex. But I think we need to also, which I should have mentioned more today, we are talking about small. Small is beautiful. I don't know if Satish, you mentioned that today, but it is the 50th anniversary of Small is Beautiful. And that book inspired me greatly. In fact, it more than that, it basically gave me the audacity to write to the Indian government and say, oh, here's an economist who says we need a different way. I'd like to start some projects in Ladakh. And that's how I ended up doing quite a lot of, and huge work there, actually. We ended up working in every village, in 100 villages, and our project became world recognized, and we won prizes for it and so on. And it was essentially based around decentralized renewable energy, which has now become a real problem because the corporate stranglehold is encouraging people to feed energy into what is a totally centralized, manipulated grid. So again, we have to be much more aware of this bigger picture of the need for decentralization is another one. So the block, one block that's interesting, a friend of mine that tried to get big business people to sit around a table and close their eyes and envision the future they want, they just sort of scraped their feet and said, this is ridiculous. They wouldn't do it. This is a few years ago, mind you. Maybe today they would try, I don't know. But I think blockages, well, what would some of you think? Yeah.
So when I say, I want to live in a community, most of my friends here commune, and I think there's a fear of, will I lose my individual freedom? And also for introverts, do I then have to be with people the whole time? So I think there's so many, and also I guess we haven't been taught how to live in community and have this conflict resolution. So there's so many aspects to that. So I guess that would be a blockage of somebody who's been in a society that romanticizes individualism. How do I live in community? A fear or something, yeah.
Well, it's just so many issues, and I have had a lot of experience because I helped to start something called a Global Eco-Village Network. And my friend who funded that will also be in Bristol. His name is Ross Jackson. He's been living in Denmark for the last 40 years, but he's a Canadian financier, and his wife became inspired partly by my book and by permaculture, and then they started this whole project to support eco-villages around the world, so communities around the world. So we dealt a lot with some of the key eco-villages and the whole issue of conflict resolution and essentially how to make them work better and to survive. Again, I have to say, I hate it. So I wish I didn't. I wish I hadn't had these experiences, because it's been pretty hard to always be trying to come and say, well, if you understand the dominant system better, I think you'll be more strategic. But what I'm saying is I feel that people were sort of starting this eco-village and just ignoring that the regulations, the taxes, everything that was pressuring them in terms of earning a living and even in terms of their identity was pushing them in the opposite direction. And I just feel if we were willing to be more clear about that and see, I'm falling into that trap, we're falling into that, how can we collectively move in the other direction? After many years of experience of wanting to live in community and even having started to set one up and then giving up on it and seeing, what's happening, I guess my vision now is that it could work best to be in a small town or near a small town and then build these deeper bridges more slowly. In the context that we're swimming in, it is very hard to do it without having a slower process. And also what I see, those that tend to work, as it were, better, tend to be guru-led. And from my point of view, not really what we're looking for. So that's my sort of practical conclusion for my own life and for others, is that it's better to start gradually building those deeper connections and not all suddenly try. And another thing people didn't realize, we have never been self-reliant. Our whole evolution, we were community reliant. And I just want to say we don't understand either how structurally important it was to have the youngest and the oldest connected, and how much we could gain by doing that. Again, like, now you take your grandmother, or, probably my age or older, from a home and try to put her together with the baby. It's not going to work. But we need to start that process, because I tell you, in the traditional culture, two things that brought tears to my eyes. I'm just saying, oh, it's so amazing. One of them was seeing the Buddhists and the Muslims, who had lived side by side for 500 years, going to celebrate each other's holidays, and clear, you're Buddhist, I'm Muslim, and friends, and celebrating each other's special days. And I remember, that was so amazing. And the other was seeing the 1-year-old with the 80-year-old, hand by hand, both barely walking well, both toothless, both hairless, they were just made for each other. And they lived like that. And there's just such a win-win-win from that. And you can't imagine what that means, for the mother as well. Another moment like that too was seeing a 13-year-old boy cooing over a baby the way a granny would, or hearing other moments. There are quite a few in Mongolia. Hearing young teenage boys singing songs about, my mother, you are so beautiful, and your breast milk is like the milk from the water from the glaciers. Teenage boys singing, and it has deep, deep significance in terms of how male and female weren't so polarized. And I think a lot of the gender trouble today is so much because what was artificially constructed was truly this commercial Barbie Rambo culture that literally comes rushing into Ladakh and Bhutan, and a traditional village where we were living in Spain at that time, trying to set up a community in a rural part of Spain. In the 80s, literally a toy shop in the Spanish village, in Bhutan and Ladakh, Rambo and Barbie doll, and then young people, suddenly the boys have to be, so tough, they have no emotion, they would never coo over a baby, they would never hold their grandmother's hand, and then the girls so nervous about not being perfectly thin, perfectly beautiful. So we had this very artificial social construct, but it's been this artificial commercial imposition. So I better not get into the gender any more than that. But I do want to say that the roadmap that I gained from Ladakh is pretty remarkable. And I'm pretty unique in carrying that, because there are very few people alive who've actually lived in a really functioning culture like that. And so, and that's why, by the way, I think many indigenous people right now don't talk so much about the social connections as I do. And I think because in many cases, some colleagues will be coming to Bristol as well. Pat McCabe, you may know Pat McCabe, and some others you probably won't have heard of. But anyway, they were, even their parents were in missionary schools where they were sexually abused. I mean, so they don't have a recollection of that remarkable human interdependence that was part of it, of truly localized indigenous ways of living.
When you talk about what I think she's called Vandana Shiva talks about, she calls them the poison cartel. And they are so powerful. And that left brain vision of economics that you talked about is also completely blind to the human equivalent of the amount of energy that is used. It just seems almost beyond imagination, as it was put, that there could be that sea change in how we see the world that Ian McGilchrist talks about.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing already when I wrote Ancient Futures in the 80s, I was seeing what I called ancient futures trends. Throughout the industrialized world, without knowing it, our culture was turning towards nature, towards the feminine, towards the indigenous. The indigenous interest is quite recent, But there were all of these micro trends. I talk about in my book too that fathers in the West would carry the baby on their bodies. The earlier generation, they wouldn't have dreamt of doing that. You know, we've been so alienated. In many ways, our cultural nadir was more like the Victorian age, when we were first driven off the land and so proudly anti-nature, you know, and just afraid of the human body, afraid of nature. So I think there's this turning that is where we could identify a lot of micro trends where we are changing. So let's remember that the real active promoters of continuing to hand more power to multi-billionaires is a tiny, tiny minority, smaller than farmers. You know, 1% of the global population, that would be, I think, 80 million. Are we 8 billion? Or not quite, 70 or 80 million. My colleagues and I are working with economists who are not very well known because they're questioning this corporate system, but you know, they would agree that, you know, we might be talking maybe 10,000 actual active promoters, government ministers, you know, people in the finance industry. A lot of people are going along with it, but they're not actually promoting further deregulation. But then right now I was talking to someone today about possibly doing some television footage because we got farmers coming from the so-called third world now, and but then they're not interested in hearing about the trade treaties or about the dominant system. They want to see on the ground that these farmers from Africa are teaching people in Wales how to farm, which is the opposite of what we're trying to say. You know, we're trying to say that real ecological knowledge would mean we understand is going to be different in Wales and in Africa. And that the whole problem has been this monoculture thinking, the same thing is right in both places. But, you know, so now what we're facing all the time is the difficulty of making the invisibility of the invisible hand of the global economic system and the various threads that are misshaping the climate debate, that are, you know, yeah. Anyway, but please don't lose faith in human nature, because that's another thing they're trying to do. And I don't know how conscious it is, but partly there is romanticization of robots, arguing that Sophia the robot can be more compassionate than we can, that we are always judgmental. There's the next step into romanticizing robots and taking us into a metaverse. That is exactly continuing this route, removing us from the land. Let's be really clear that we want to go back. Let's use these technologies of communication to communicate that, to support each other. Many small will always be more powerful than one big, ultimately. Many small farms can produce far more food per acre than a big monoculture. And so we mustn't, you know, as long as the small can connect, and we need to connect at that deeper level, and that means more face-to-face communication, which is why we're also having a global summit to support the local, which is paradoxical. But yeah, thank you.